The storm hit hard that night. Dust, thunder, and a woman on the edge of nowhere dragging 3 hungry boys through the wind. She didn't beg when she reached his gate. She just whispered, "Please." The cowboy looked at her, then at the children, and said the words no one ever expected to hear out here. And right then, everything changed. The sky wasn't blue that evening, it was the color of old sorrow, bruised and bleeding out across the plains. The sun had burned itself to a pale ember over the dry mesa, and the air tasted of dust, rust, and something older than both, hunger. A woman walked that road alone, her skirt torn, her breath shallow as a prayer half forgotten. Behind her trailed 3 boys, barefoot, silent, eyes wide as the western moon. One carried a tin cup, another a wooden horse missing its head. The youngest clung to her hand like it was the last warm thing left in the world. The wind kept pushing against them, as if trying to erase their path. They hadn't eaten since the night before last. Water had turned to dust, and the bread to memory. The cart that once carried their things had splintered back along the canyon bend. One wheel shattered. The mule collapsed beside it. She'd buried the beast herself, pressing dry soil over its eyes, whispering, "Rest, old friend." Every step after that felt like walking through grief itself. By dusk, her shawl was crusted with red grit. The oldest boy stumbled, catching his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he rasped, "my legs don't work." She lifted him anyway. Thin arms trembling, the baby pressed against her hip. Her middle son trudging beside her without complaint. Just a look, fierce and frightened, that said he wouldn't let go. That was how the rancher first saw them. 4 shapes barely human, walking through the dust storm like ghosts that had forgotten they were dead. He was standing on his porch, hat low, rifle leaning against the wall. The wind whipped through the valley, carrying the kind of silence that made a man remember his sins. The widow's figure moved through that silence, step by slow step until she reached his gate. Her voice broke when she spoke. "Please, sir." "My boys, we need water." He didn't move. For a moment he just stared, the widow's face, pale beneath the dirt, her eyes hollow and wild but still holding something that looked like faith. He set down the rifle and walked toward her, boots sinking into dust. "You come far?" She nodded weakly. "From Carson's Crossing." They said there was work, maybe bread, but there was neither. He studied the children, thin as fence rails, cheeks sunken. "And your man?" "Gone," she whispered. "Buried near the river." The wind caught her hair then, lifting it across her face, and he saw the mark on her ring finger, the kind that said, "Love once lived there." He gestured toward the cabin. "Come on then." Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of beans and ash. The fire snapped once, spitting sparks onto the hearth. The widow's boys huddled near it, wide-eyed, the warmth making their faces bloom with faint color again. She stood behind them, hands clasped, as if afraid to take up space. The rancher poured water into a cup, his hands rough but steady. "Drink slow," he warned. "You'll make yourself sick." The oldest boy obeyed, trembling. The youngest stared at the man like he was watching a miracle he didn't trust. After the 3rd cup was passed and emptied, she said softly, "We'll go at dawn." The rancher looked at her then, really looked. The curve of exhaustion in her shoulders, the way her fingers still hovered near her boys even when they slept. There was a strength there, quiet and stubborn, the kind that doesn't break, it just bends until the world stops pushing. He spoke without meaning to. "No, you'll stay till you can stand without swaying." Her lips parted as if to argue, but the words never came. Only a single tear slid through the dust on her cheek, carving a clean line of truth. He turned away, embarrassed by something he didn't yet understand. Later, when the storm came again, roaring red, and full of the ghosts of the desert, he found her kneeling by the fire, wrapping the youngest in a quilt too small for 4. He cleared his throat. "Bed's in the back room. They'll rest easier there." She nodded, whispering a thank you so soft it was nearly lost to the thunder. He didn't sleep that night, sat by the window instead, watching lightning trace white scars across the hills. Every flash lit her silhouette through the half-open door, bent over her boys, hair spilling loose, the kind of image that burned itself into a man's chest and stayed there. When dawn came, the storm had passed, and the earth smelled clean again. The rancher rose, slow and tired, and whispered to himself, "They're my boys now." He didn't know why he said it, only that it felt true, like something the land itself demanded he speak aloud. The morning broke gentle, though the land itself looked beaten. Mud-streaked fence lines, a trough overturned, and tumbleweeds drowned in last night's storm water. The air smelled of wet earth and new chances. Inside the ranch house, the fire had burned low, but its warmth still lingered like a secret that refused to die. The widow, her name, he'd later learn was Clara May, moved quietly about the kitchen, her hair damp, face still pale but alive again. The boys slept on pallets near the hearth, their bellies full for the first time in weeks. She turned at the sound of boots scuffing on the porch, her hands instinctively finding the folds of her apron. "You're up early," she said softly. The rancher, Luke Harland, set down a pail of water and nodded. Storm filled the creek. "Thought I'd fetch what I could before it dries up." His voice had the grit of gravel, but beneath it ran a kind of care he didn't yet know how to show. Clara looked at the pail, then at him. "You didn't have to," he shrugged. "Ain't much sense in letting good water go to waste." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. Gratitude came hard to those who'd lost too much. It always carried the ghost of debt behind it. The hours drifted slow. Luke repaired a broken shutter, mended a rail, fed the horses. Clara swept, cooked, folded, and kept her distance. It was a strange rhythm. Two people working side by side, both careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had begun to form between them. By noon, the boys were awake and laughing, chasing a stray chicken through the yard. Luke caught himself watching them from the porch, a memory tugging somewhere deep. His own son, long gone, buried near the cottonwoods out back. Clara noticed the look in his eyes. "But you had children," she said, not asking so much as understanding. "One boy," Luke replied, "died young. His ma too." The silence that followed was soft, not cruel. It was the kind that speaks more truth than words ever could. That evening she insisted on cooking. The smell of beans and cornbread filled the cabin, carrying a strange comfort. When the boys had eaten their fill, Luke lingered by the fire, his hat resting on his knee. Clara stitched a tear in the youngest's sleeve, her fingers trembling from exhaustion. Luke watched, unsure if it was right to feel what he felt, a slow warmth blooming where loneliness had long taken root. After the boys fell asleep, she reached for the kettle. "Coffee?" He nodded, though he wasn't thirsty. She poured, her hand brushing his again, the same way it had that first night. This time neither moved away. For a long while the only sound was the fire's low hum and the wind breathing through the cracks in the wall. Luke broke the silence first. "You plan to keep moving when the weather clears?" Clara's eyes stayed on the flames. "There's nowhere left to go." He hesitated, then said, "Then stay a while. Help with the place. The boys can learn a few things." Her breath caught. "You'd let her stay? Just like that?" He met her gaze, steady and quiet. "You needed a door. I had one. It wasn't a confession, but it was close." That night, when he turned in, he paused at the doorway. The firelight painted her face gold. The boys curled at her feet. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel empty. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Maybe ghosts ain't the only ones that come knocking." And though she didn't hear it, something in her stirred, like a memory of rain after too many seasons of dust. Days passed into weeks, and the valley began to breathe again. The rains had turned the earth soft, and for the first time in months, color returned to the land. Green shoots curling up through the mud, sunlight spilling warm over the ridge. The widow and her boys found rhythm in the ranch's quiet heart. Clara mended what was torn, polished what was forgotten, and filled the silence with small kindnesses. A loaf of bread left by his plate, a patched shirt folded neat on his chair. Luke noticed everyone but never spoke of it. He was a man trained by loss to hold his words close, yet somehow her presence loosened their edges. Most nights, they sat by the fire, the boys already asleep, the air thick with the sound of crickets and unspoken things. One evening, the youngest boy, Ben, caught a fever. It came sudden, burning and wild. By midnight he was trembling, mumbling through cracked lips. Clara knelt beside him, damp cloth in hand, panic rising in her chest like floodwater. Luke found her there, candlelight shaking in her grasp. "Let me," he said. She shook her head, eyes glassy. "He's all I have." He knelt beside her anyway, his hands rough but sure. "Then we do it together." Through the long night they took turns, cooling the boy's skin, spooning water, whispering prayers neither believed in, but both needed. When dawn came pale and tired, Ben's breathing steadied. Clara slumped against the wall, tears sliding silent down her cheeks. Luke sat beside her, shoulders brushing. For the first time, she didn't move away. "You saved him," she whispered. He stared at the boy. "No, just kept him till the fever broke." But she looked at him differently after that, not as the man who'd taken pity, but as the man who'd stayed. Later, as the sun broke across the valley, she found him outside fixing the fence. "You didn't sleep," she said. He smiled faintly. "Didn't need to." There was a pause, long, soft, the kind that changes things. "Luke," she said carefully, "why do you help us? You could have sent us on." He leaned on the fence post, eyes far away. "Because once someone didn't help me, and I've been trying to balance the scales ever since." She studied him, the way grief sat quiet in his shoulders. "Your wife?" He nodded once. "And my boy." Fever took 'em both. Whole house went quiet after that. I reckon the silence near finished me. Her voice broke. "And now?" He met her eyes, steady and gentle. "Now it's not so quiet anymore." That night, as the fire burned low, Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. Luke was sitting on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the stars drift over the ridge. She joined him without a word. For a long while, they sat in silence, the kind that no longer hurt. He didn't turn to her, didn't touch her hand, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every unsaid thing between them. "Out here," he murmured, "you learn that some folks are worth staying for." She looked at him then, eyes glistening in the starlight. "And if I asked you to stay?" He smiled faintly, eyes never leaving the horizon. "I already did." From the window, the faint sound of the boy's laughter drifted out, a sound he hadn't heard in his home since his own child's voice faded years ago. And for the first time in forever, Luke Harland believed the West could give back what it had taken. Spring brought gossip before it brought blossoms. It started in town, whispers curling through the saloon and general store like smoke. A widow living out at Harland's place. 3 young'uns too. Man's lost his mind or found himself a new sin. By the time Luke rode in for supplies, the stairs had teeth. He felt them on his back as he filled his sack with flour and coffee. Clara's name hung in the air like dust that wouldn't settle. He kept his hat low and said nothing. When he came home that evening, the boys were building a fort out by the corral. Clara was sweeping the porch, humming faintly. But when she saw his face, the broom stilled in her hand. "What happened?" "Nothing," he said. "Just talk," she frowned. "About us?" He nodded once. "Folks always need a story. Easier than facing their own emptiness." That night the air was heavy, full of things neither wanted to say. She sat by the window after the boys had gone to bed, the lantern flickering soft against her face. "I can't have you ruined for our sake," she said quietly. "We'll leave in the morning." Luke stood from his chair. "You think I give a damn what they say?" "I think you've lost enough already," she answered. "Don't lose the rest to me." He crossed the room, slow and deliberate, until he was standing inches from her. "You and those boys gave this place a pulse again. Let 'em talk. They ain't here at night when the wind dies and a man can breathe again." Her eyes filled. "You don't mean that." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing hers. "I mean every word." Before she could reply, a shout split the night. The cattle pen open. Luke was out the door before she could move. The storm wind had rolled in again, wild and hard, and in its chaos shadows moved. 3 riders driving his herd toward the canyon. Rustlers. He fired once, twice, the sound cracking through the rain. One horse spooked and fled. Another rider wheeled and fired back, the bullet grazing Luke's shoulder. He stumbled, dropped to one knee, and the world blurred red. Clara ran into the storm, bare feet sinking in the mud. She found him bleeding by the gate, rifle half buried in the dirt. "Luke!" she cried, pressing her hands to the wound. "Stay with me." He gritted his teeth. "Get the boys inside." "Not without you." He managed a smile, weak and stubborn. "Woman, I ain't dying in the mud." The riders were gone. The herd scattered but not lost. She helped him back inside, trembling from fear and cold. He slumped into the chair by the fire, blood soaking through his shirt. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to his wound. When she met his eyes, they weren't just full of pain. They were full of something unspoken and fierce. "You don't leave," he said hoarsely. "Not after this. Not ever." Tears fell freely down her cheeks. "You don't get to decide that, Luke Harland." He gripped her wrist, voice low but certain. "Then stay because you decide it." Outside, the rain began to ease. The thunder faded, replaced by the soft crackle of the fire. She stayed by him till morning, her hand never leaving his. By dawn, the fever broke. When he woke, she was still there, head resting against his arm. The boys curled up near the hearth. He whispered into her hair, barely a breath, "I don't care what they say. Clara, they're my boys now." And for the first time, she didn't cry from fear or hunger. She cried because someone had finally meant it. The next days passed in a hush, like the land itself was holding its breath. The sky was wide and clean again, painted with the pale gold of early summer. The cattle were safe, the boys back to laughter, and Luke's shoulder healing, though slower than he'd admit. Clara tended to him with steady hands, each movement quiet and deliberate. She'd change his bandage at dawn, pour coffee before he could rise, and walk the fence line by afternoon. Every gesture said more than any vow could. The talk in town hadn't stopped, but Luke no longer cared. He rode in once more, head high, nodding to every whisper and stare. When the storekeeper muttered, "So the widow's still living out there?" Luke just smiled. "She's got more courage than half the men in this valley." And that was the end of that. By midsummer, the wildflowers bloomed thick across the valley. Clara's boys raced through them, laughter echoing off the hills. She stood on the porch one evening, wiping her hands on her apron, watching Luke mend a fence post. His shirt clung to his back, the evening light catching the scar at his shoulder. He turned, catching her watching him. "Something on your mind, Clara May?" She smiled shyly. "Just wondering if you'd ever let someone else fix that fence for once." He chuckled low. "Haven't learned how to sit still yet." She stepped closer, her heart loud in her chest. "Maybe it's time you tried." He looked at her a long moment, then set down the hammer. "You saying that as a neighbor or something else?" Her answer came quiet, but it carried clear across the field. As someone who's stayed long enough to know where she belongs. Luke took off his hat, holding it against his chest. "Then I reckon it's time I asked proper." He led her down the path, past the corral and the cottonwoods, to the small rise where two weathered crosses stood, his wife's and his boys'. The wind moved soft through the grass, carrying the smell of cedar and rain. He knelt, fingers brushing the dry earth. "You once said you didn't want me ruined for your sake," he said softly. "Truth is, Clara, you saved what was left." Her eyes filled. "Luke?" He rose, taking her hands in his. "I ain't a man for fancy words, but I know this. When I see those boys running the field, I see what I lost coming back to me, and when I see you, I see home." The wind stilled. Even the land seemed to listen. She trembled, laughing through tears. "You sure you want a woman with 3 boys and a past?" He smiled, that slow, weary smile that carried more truth than promises ever could. "They're my boys now, remember? And you, well, you've been mine since the night the storm found us." He slipped a small silver band from his pocket, the one he'd worn around his neck for years, a keepsake from another life, and placed it in her palm. "Not to replace what's gone," he said, "but to begin what's left." She nodded, unable to speak. The boys ran up then, laughing, breathless. Luke lifted the youngest high, spinning him once, and the child's laughter rang through the valley like church bells. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the sky turned copper and rose. Clara leaned against him, her voice a whisper against his chest. "Do you think it'll last, Luke?" He pressed his chin into her hair. "It will. Out here, love's like the land, it don't come easy. But once it roots, it don't let go." The horizon burned with light, and the wind carried the scent of promise through the open valley. "Tomorrow's a new day," she whispered. He nodded, eyes soft. "And this time we ride it together. If Clara's courage and Luke's promise touched your heart, don't let this story drift away like dust on the prairie. Like this video, subscribe and ring the bell, because out here in the Wild West, love may be rarer than rain. But when it comes, it changes everything.